At the previous level, we saw how effort fades when the mind learns that resistance changes nothing. Tonight, we go deeper still. Because when escape comes to feel impossible, consciousness searches for another way to survive. Not by leaving, but by choosing a side. Carl Gustav Jung looked directly at this moment with a cold clarity. He understood that the human psyche cannot live indefinitely suspended between pain and meaninglessness. When it no longer believes escape is possible, the psyche needs a structure to cling to. And the most accessible structure is identification. Taking a side, adopting a narrative, putting on an identity clear enough to end inner conflict. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. Balance, even a poor one, is still more tolerable than prolonged contradiction." Choosing a side here is not necessarily political or social. It is far more subtle. It may be the side of endurance, the side of realism, the side of those who understand how life really is, the side of not dreaming. When you stand on a side, you no longer have to ask, "What else could I do?" That question disappears, along with its pain. Jung warned that the calm achieved by extinguishing the question is not reconciliation, but freezing. He wrote, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness. When escape is no longer a living possibility, the psyche changes strategy. It turns circumstance into identity. Staying is no longer something imposed. Staying becomes right. Right, reasonable, mature." Jung called this process identification with the object, when the ego dissolves into what is holding it captive. He warned very clearly, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Individuation, becoming oneself, comes to a halt the moment we turn the cage into our side. The Stoics recognized this temptation early. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." But mastery is not choosing a side to avoid pain. It is maintaining inner distance from every side. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, "If it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it." When one chooses a side in order to survive, the standards of right and true are replaced by the standard of less painful. And so morality dissolves into psychological convenience. Jung understood why this is seductive. When you have resisted and failed, choosing a side allows you to stop fighting without calling it surrender. You can say, "I understand now. I accept it. I stand with reality." These sentences bring calm, but calm is not always freedom. Jung wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." When the rightful pain of disagreement is avoided, the psyche manufactures a substitute peace, the peace of siding with what already is. What is subtle is this: choosing a side reduces the burden of imagination. You no longer have to imagine another future. Your side has already spoken for you. You no longer have to weigh possibilities. Your side has already decided. Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. Once the idea, "this is my side," takes control, it organizes emotions, memories, and reasoning in its own defense. Truth becomes what fits the side, not what must be examined. In this state, control no longer requires force. It is internalized. You protect the very structure that keeps you in place, because that structure protects you from helplessness. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When choosing a side happens unconsciously, you do not call it a strategy. You call it who you are. The Stoics would say that suffering increases when we confuse what is within our control with what is not. Choosing a side blends the two. You place identity within your control onto circumstance outside your control. Seneca warned, "He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a man who is alive." But here, the fear is not death. It is the emptiness of standing on no side at all. That emptiness hurts more than staying. Jung did not condemn those who choose a side. He saw it as a survival reflex when exits are sealed. He offered only a quiet reminder. Choosing a side resolves conflict, but it does not create freedom. Freedom, for Jung, requires distance, the capacity to not fully belong to any side, so that one can still hear one's own voice. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness here is the need to choose a side in order to avoid pain. When that need is seen, it loses its silent power. Tonight, there is no need to leave your side, no need to fight the structure that keeps you standing. Simply notice this. If you are standing on a side in order to survive, that says nothing bad about you. It only says that escape once felt too costly. That recognition opens a very small gap between you and your side. And within that gap, a question can return, very softly. If I did not need to choose a side to survive, what would I choose?" At the next level, we will explore what happens when identity itself is built around choosing a side, and when leaving that side feels like betraying oneself. Jung understood this as the deepest lock, when freedom no longer stands opposed to fear, but to the ego itself. But tonight, we stop here, because as Jung reminds us, the mind does not need victory in order to heal. It only needs to be seen. And sometimes, seeing that we chose a side to survive, not to be right, is already a very quiet step toward freedom. And when choosing a side has soothed inner conflict, when standing on one side allows us to stop facing the feeling of helplessness, the mind moves into the next stage of survival, seeking safety through consensus. The human mind is designed to survive before it is designed to understand. Carl Gustav Jung recognized this as a foundational law of psychological life. When physical freedom becomes uncertain, when exits are unclear or emotionally too costly, consciousness looks for safety elsewhere, not in space, but in meaning. And the most easily available meaning is consensus. Consensus does not necessarily mean full agreement. It is the feeling that everything has a reason, that our fear fits into a coherent story. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. The psyche seeks balance before it seeks truth. When danger cannot be removed, balance is achieved by reframing that danger as familiar, even as reasonable." Here, consensus becomes protection. When you say, "This is necessary. This is just how things are. There is no other choice," the nervous system calms, not because the danger has disappeared, but because meaning has been assigned to it. Jung understood that meaning functions like a psychological sedative. He wrote, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." When an idea is coherent enough to explain fear, it takes control, and fear is contained within its framework. The subtlety is this: consensus does not need to be correct to be effective. It only needs to be consistent. When the source of fear is reframed as familiar, the nervous system shifts from vigilance to stable endurance. Jung warned, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness." When meaning-making happens unconsciously, we no longer notice that we are trading freedom for calm. The Stoics also recognized this mechanism. Epictetus said, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things." When a way of seeing is normalized through consensus, fear becomes socialized, and therefore less lonely. It is no longer just you who is afraid. Everyone is. That feeling soothes the nervous system, because emotional isolation is often more painful than danger itself. Jung went further. When fear is wrapped in collective meaning, it changes color. From a threat, it becomes reality. From something to be avoided, it becomes something to be accepted. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When we label reframed fear as fate, we stop questioning, and when questioning stops, inner conflict diminishes. But what is the cost of this calming? It is the narrowing of possibility. Consensus stabilizes the nervous system by closing off alternatives. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, if it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it. But when consensus is used for survival, the standards of right and true are replaced by the standard of less stressful. And so inner morality is softened. Jung did not judge this process. He understood it as a survival strategy when physical freedom is unstable. He wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." The unconscious seeks to keep you alive, sometimes through compromises the conscious mind does not like. Consensus is one of those compromises. Less pain in exchange for less freedom. The danger is this. Consensus, when repeated long enough, becomes personal belief. You no longer say, "I agree," in order to stay calm. You say, "I believe." Jung called this the internalization of external structures. Once the structure is brought inside, control no longer needs force. You begin to defend the very story that once kept you safe. The Stoics would warn that safety achieved by trading away freedom is not peace. Seneca wrote, "A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." But here, we do not suffer in advance. We stop hoping, and when hope stops, suffering does not erupt. It stretches out. Calm appears, but it is the calm of a future that has been closed. Jung called this moment the settlement of meaning. Once meaning has settled, the nervous system stabilizes, but the soul stops expanding. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is the need to assign meaning in order to avoid fear. When that need is seen, consensus loses its absolute authority. You may still agree, but you no longer identify yourself with the agreement. What matters is this: there is no need to break consensus immediately. Breaking it before the nervous system is ready only increases fear. Jung suggested a quieter step: maintaining awareness. Recognizing that emotional safety gained through consensus does not reveal ultimate truth. It only reveals what the nervous system currently needs. When that recognition appears, a very small distance opens between the meaning that keeps us safe and a truth that may be larger. That distance does not create chaos. It keeps the door open, and for Jung, keeping the door open is already an act of freedom. At the next level, we will explore what happens when consensus no longer merely soothes fear, but begins to shape identity, when disagreement feels dangerous and difference is experienced as a threat to survival. But tonight, we stop here. Because, as Jung understood so clearly, inner freedom does not confront fear head-on. It begins by seeing why we need to feel safe, and allowing that reason to exist without letting it define the whole of who we are. And when consensus has calmed the nervous system, when fear has been wrapped in meaning so it can be endured, the mind takes one more very quiet step. It begins to justify. At first, the justifications are small. They're under a lot of pressure. They didn't mean to. They're doing the best they can. These statements carry no malice. They even sound humane. And precisely because of that, they are effective. Carl Gustav Jung understood that the human psyche cannot tolerate prolonged contradiction. When a reality is threatening and we cannot leave it, the mind does the only thing left to survive. It softens that reality through interpretation, Jung wrote. The psyche seeks equilibrium. The psyche seeks balance before it seeks truth. When chaos cannot be escaped, it will be explained. And explanation brings a very particular sensation, the feeling of control. Not control over circumstances, but control over the meaning of circumstances. When you can explain why something is happening, fear diminishes. Not because the danger disappears, but because it now has a place in your story. These small justifications act like shock absorbers for the nervous system. They soften the sharp edges of threat, instead of facing the naked truth, that this hurts you, that this is not okay. You face aversion with reasons, context, and room for sympathy. Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. When the idea, everything has a reason, takes hold, it reorganizes memory, emotion, and judgment in its own defense. What is subtle is this: justification is not lying. It is the selection of a perspective, and that perspective is chosen not because it is true, but because it is more tolerable. Jung understood that the psyche has a deep need for coherence. When events are fragmented, contradictory, and unpredictable, the mind is under strain. But when you weave them into a coherent story, even one that is unfair to you, the nervous system relaxes, Jung wrote. The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness. The danger is not that you interpret, but that you fail to see that you are interpreting in order to survive. When justification happens unconsciously, it no longer feels like a temporary strategy. It becomes the only way to understand the world. And then, reality is no longer experienced as it is, but as it must be for you to remain. The Stoics recognized this mechanism as well, though they named it differently. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." Justification is a soothing form of judgment. It does not erase pain, but it lowers its intensity by shifting focus from your experience to the intentions of others. And when you are busy understanding others, you are spared from having to fully face yourself. Jung saw even deeper. Justification preserves the coherence of identity. If you were to admit that what is happening is unacceptable, you would have to ask, then why am I still here? That question is dangerous because it threatens the entire survival structure you have built. So the psyche chooses the path of least energy, adjusting interpretation rather than changing circumstances. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When you continually justify, you do not call it a strategy. You call it maturity, understanding, consideration for others. And because these labels are socially praised, the process is reinforced rather than questioned. What is worth noticing is this: each time you justify, an inner boundary retreats slightly. At first, you excuse a single behavior, then you excuse a pattern, then you excuse an entire system that causes harm. Jung described this as the gradual slippage of consciousness, not because you are weak, but because you are trying to make the world livable. Jung drew a sharp distinction between understanding and self-erasure. Understanding is a conscious act that preserves distance. Self-erasure occurs when understanding becomes a tool for staying, no longer a choice. He warned, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. When you identify with the role of the understanding one, You lose the right to ask whether this situation is harming you. The Stoics would say that virtue does not lie in enduring everything, but in judging correctly. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it." But when justification becomes a survival habit, the standard of right is replaced by the standard of keeping the peace, and so truth is softened, not because it is false, but because it is too dangerous to acknowledge. Jung did not condemn justification. He understood that it keeps you alive in unsafe conditions. But he emphasized the cost, the blurring of intuition. When everything has a reason, nothing is wrong enough to demand change. And when nothing is wrong enough, movement stops. Jung's exit is not to abruptly stop justifying. That would only panic the nervous system. The exit is to bring justification into the light, to see it as a strategy, not as truth. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is the need to explain in order to survive. When that need is seen, it loses its moral disguise. You may still feel compassion, but you no longer trade yourself for it. And then, very slowly, a new question may arise. Not to accuse, but to orient. If I did not need to justify in order to stay, how would I see this? That question does not demand immediate action. It simply restores the right to feel. Because as Jung understood so clearly, explanation gives the feeling of control, but awareness gives freedom. When you see that you are justifying to keep the world coherent, you do not need to dismantle that coherence at once. You only need to stop letting it obscure the truth of your experience. And it is precisely in that very quiet moment, when explanation is no longer absolute, that a small opening appears. Not to escape, but to breathe. And when justification has become a way to keep the world from collapsing, the mind takes one more extremely subtle step. It begins to blur the boundary between good and evil. Good and evil do not disappear. They simply no longer stand apart. Moments of kindness are magnified. Moments of harm are minimized. In a desperate effort to preserve coherence, the mind begins emotional bookkeeping. It keeps a carefully balanced ledger. If they were truly bad, they would never be gentle. If they can be gentle, then perhaps the pain has a reason. This is not denial. It is adaptation. Carl Gustav Jung understood this mechanism with great clarity. He knew that the human psyche cannot tolerate a completely evil image of that upon which it still depends, so it dilutes evil with fragments of good. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. The psyche seeks balance before it seeks truth. When faced with an irreconcilable contradiction, love and fear, need and pain, the mind chooses the least destructive path. It blurs the boundary. This blurring does not happen through a conscious decision. It happens in the way memory is retold. A gentle gesture is remembered vividly. A hurtful remark is placed in quotation marks. They didn't mean it. One act of care becomes central evidence. Repeated harm becomes an exception." Jung described this as a restructuring of the unconscious, where experience is rearranged to protect psychological integrity. He warned, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." When the idea everything has a reason takes control, it orchestrates memory according to the needs of survival. The subtlety lies here. The mind is not lying. It is selecting. And that selection wears a moral disguise: fairness, understanding, compassion. But Jung emphasized that compassion, when used to remain in harm, turns into self-erasure. He wrote, "Identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. And when you identify with the role of the balanced one, the understanding one, the one who sees both sides. You lose the right to say that some behaviors cannot be justified by gentleness. This adaptation soothes the nervous system. It tells you that the world still has order, that pain is not random, that if you are patient enough, fair enough, understanding enough, the scales will rebalance. Jung understood the comfort of this illusion, but he also saw the cost. Intuition becomes blurred. When everything is balanced, nothing is wrong enough to make you stop. The Stoics warned against this confusion as well, though in different language. Epictetus advised, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Clarity can appear cruel because it refuses to soften what is unacceptable. Marcus Aurelius wrote, if it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it. But when good and evil are blurred for survival, the standard of right is replaced by the standard of bearable. Jung looked directly into this trap. Moments of gentleness do not erase structures that cause harm. They only make them easier to live with. And because they are easier to live with, you stay longer. He wrote, the greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness. The danger is not noticing the good moments, but allowing them to define the entire reality. When a single kind gesture becomes evidence that negates all harm, moral boundaries erode. This adaptation produces another effect. Responsibility is reversed. If both good and evil have reasons, if everything is balanced, then pain becomes a personal lesson. You begin to ask, am I not patient enough? Do I not understand deeply enough? Jung called this the inversion of judgment, when judgment that should be directed outward turns inward instead. He warned that this feeds the shadow, not in others, but in yourself. That shadow consists of suppressed anger, rationalized grief, distrusted intuition. Jung did not call for denying moments of goodness. He called for placing them correctly. Gentleness is not a license for harm. Good is not a shield for evil. He wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness here is the need to blur boundaries in order to remain. When that need is seen, it loses its silent authority. The key is awareness of adaptation. When you notice that you are magnifying good moments in order to endure bad ones, you do not need to break away immediately. Jung understood that abrupt rupture only sends the nervous system into panic. He proposed a smaller, deeper step, restoring names to things, calling harm harm, even when it comes with gentleness, holding two truths side by side without mixing them, because, as Jung saw so clearly, truth does not need to win in order to work. It only needs to retain its shape. When good and evil are no longer blended for survival, intuition begins to breathe again. And when intuition breathes, boundaries gradually return, not as moral judgment, but as orientation for living. Blurring boundaries is an intelligent survival strategy. It keeps you safe in the short term. But prolonged, it steals the capacity to discern. Jung believed that individuation begins only when we can tolerate the imbalance of truth, when we can say, this has good moments and this causes harm. Both exist, and I do not need to blend them in order to stay. When you can say that, without shouting, without accusation, simply through a quiet recognition, boundaries return, not to attack, but to protect your integrity. And when the boundary between good and evil has been blurred, so that the mind can remain, a deeper shift occurs. Inner distance disappears, and identification begins to replace judgment. Stoic philosophy teaches clarity as the foundation of inner freedom, but clarity requires distance. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." To avoid being dyed, the soul needs space. Epictetus reminded us, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. That distance allows you to tolerate the discomfort of not merging with the crowd, of not agreeing simply to feel safe. But when distance is no longer available, when stepping back feels dangerous, identification becomes the path of survival. Identification is not loud. It does not arrive through vows of loyalty. It comes through a very quiet choice, seeing the world through their lens, their fears, their frustrations, their explanations, not because you believe these to be ultimate truth, but because sharing the same worldview reduces friction. And friction, to a nervous system that has learned fear, feels dangerous. Carl Gustav Jung understood this mechanism deeply. He knew that when distance disappears, the psyche no longer judges, it dissolves. Jung wrote, "Identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Identification is the moment when the I stops standing apart to observe and instead flows into the meaning system of another. There, you no longer need to ask difficult questions. You only need to share. And that sharing soothes anxiety." Jung did not see this as weakness. He saw it as a survival reflex. When distance brings risk, rejection, punishment, isolation, the psyche chooses harmony. He wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. The psyche seeks balance before it seeks truth. Identification produces balance quickly. The same language, the same fears, the same explanations. No friction, no comparison, and therefore no clarity." Stoic philosophy warns that clarity cannot exist if we surrender independent judgment. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." But when you see the world through another's lens, you outsource judgment in exchange for emotional safety. Not because you wish to lose freedom, but because freedom has begun to feel stressful. And stress, in this context, is labeled as danger. The subtlety is this: identification does not erase the self immediately. It changes the standard. What once unsettled you is now called reality. What once made you question is now labeled naive. Jung described this process as the staining of the unconscious. Ideas repeated, shared, sink into the unconscious, and operate as reality itself. He warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When another's worldview becomes your default context, you do not call it a choice, you call it life. Identification also reduces inner responsibility. If you share their fears, you do not have to face your own. If you repeat their explanations, you do not have to endure uncertainty. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events, but when distance disappears, that power is outsourced. You react to another's rhythm, call it harmony, and forget that harmony is not the same as clarity." Jung emphasized that identification is the price paid when distance no longer feels safe. It brings short-term calm, but it erodes intuition. When you see through their eyes long enough, you stop trusting your original perceptions. You learn to doubt inner discomfort because it creates friction, and friction, in a system where safety is purchased through agreement, is treated as a threat. The Stoics would call this a confusion between calm and freedom. Seneca wrote, "A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." But identification leads you to endure in order to avoid friction, and to call that endurance wisdom. Jung was more explicit. When identification persists, identity dissolves. Not through brute force, but through subtle adaptation. You may still have opinions, as long as they align. You may still have feelings, as long as they do not disrupt. Jung's central insight is this: clarity requires inner distance, not necessarily physical distance. That distance is the ability to hold two truths at once. I understand their fear, and I don't need to make it mine. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness here is the fear of friction, the fear that if you do not identify, you will lose safety." The path Jung proposed is not resistance. Resistance at this stage only heightens nervous tension. The path is to recognize identification as a survival strategy. When you see this, you can begin to restore a very small distance, a moment of listening to intuition before repeating an explanation, a silent question before nodding along, not to create friction, but to keep the light of judgment from going out. Stoic clarity is not coldness, it is honesty with experience. Marcus Aurelius advised, "If it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it." When distance returns, you do not need to announce anything. You only need to stop saying what you no longer believe. And sometimes, that silence itself becomes the saving distance. Because in the end, identification reduces friction, but clarity creates direction. Jung believed that individuation begins only when we dare to tolerate a little friction in order to keep truth intact. Not to win, not to accuse, but to avoid losing oneself inside another's fear. And when you can hold that distance, however small, the world no longer needs to be seen through their lens for you to feel safe. Clarity returns not as rebellion, but as a deep breath. And when inner distance has vanished, when identification has become the safest refuge, the mind learns one final survival skill: leaning into the storm. Imagine yourself standing in the middle of a storm. The wind does not stop. You cannot command it to soften. But if you tilt your body in the same direction, resistance decreases. The body hurts less. Breathing steadies. You are still in the storm, but you are less torn apart. This is how the mind learns loyalty, not out of admiration, not out of trust, but out of exhaustion. Carl Gustav Jung understood that such loyalty is not a moral choice, but a survival adaptation. When resistance has consumed too much energy, when distance is no longer available, the psyche searches for another way to endure. It aligns. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. The psyche seeks balance before it seeks truth. Leaning with the wind creates immediate balance. No more friction, no more constant strain, and in that relief, loyalty takes root, very quietly. The danger is this: this loyalty is not experienced as submission. It is experienced as wisdom, as realism, as maturity." Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. When the idea going along hurts less takes control, it reorganizes judgment. You no longer ask, "Is this right?" You ask, "Does this tear me less?" And once that standard is accepted, it rewrites the inner moral map. The Stoics spoke of inner freedom amid adversity, but they never confused endurance with virtue. Epictetus reminded us, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Yet when exhaustion is prolonged, mastery becomes too costly. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." But this was never advice to dissolve into the storm. It was a reminder to preserve judgment even under difficulty. When judgment disappears, going with the wind ceases to be a strategy. It becomes fate, rationalized. Jung called this phenomenon exhaustion-based identification, when the ego no longer stands apart to observe, but merges with the dominating force. He wrote, "Identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. When you lean with the storm long enough, you no longer feel yourself leaning. The new posture becomes upright, and what once felt like headwind Questions, intuition, resistance now feels dangerous. Loyalty born of exhaustion has a distinct feature. It rewards silence. Each time you do not react, do not question, the nervous system rests. Each time you repeat the familiar explanation, the storm seems to howl less. Jung would say that the unconscious learns through reinforcement. What reduces pain gets repeated. Very quickly, alignment becomes habit, and then identity. Here, the boundary between choice and reflex blurs. You do not swear loyalty, you drift into it. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When loyalty operates unconsciously, it does not feel imposed. It feels natural, reasonable, inevitable. And that feeling is precisely what makes it endure. The Stoics knew that clarity requires distance, but distance requires energy. Seneca wrote, "A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." Exhaustion makes the mind pay the price of freedom in advance to purchase short-term calm. And because calm arrives immediately, while freedom lies farther away, the inner market chooses calm. Jung did not condemn this loyalty. He understood that it keeps you alive, but he emphasized the cost. Direction disappears. When you lean with the storm, you lose your sense of north. You no longer have a standard by which to say this is not right, because speaking creates resistance, and resistance, in a state of exhaustion, feels dangerous. What is subtle is this. Loyalty born of exhaustion can look noble. It speaks the language of sacrifice, of understanding, of for the sake of peace. Jung warned against this mask. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness here is the fear of friction, the fear that if you stand upright, you will be torn apart. When that fear is seen, loyalty loses its moral halo and reveals its true nature, a posture against pain. The path Jung proposed is not to stand upright in the middle of the storm. That would only panic the nervous system. The path is to restore judgment gradually. One moment of recognition. I am leaning because I am tired, not because this is right. One small question held in silence. If I had enough energy, how would I stand? Jung believed that as long as the question remains alive, identity is not fully sealed. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." That power does not need to be used to fight immediately. It can be used simply to refuse to call alignment truth. When you no longer confuse the two, loyalty born of exhaustion begins to loosen, not through force, but through honesty, because in the end, leaning with the storm reduces resistance, but it trades away direction. Jung believed that individuation does not require you to fight every wind, but it does require you to recognize when you are leaning merely to survive. That recognition does not create rebellion. It creates a small space, very small, where judgment can return. And when judgment returns, even as a single breath, you may still be in the storm, but you no longer call the wind direction your compass. Loyalty then ceases to be a reflex of exhaustion. It returns to its rightful meaning, a choice made with distance. The storm may not have stopped, but you don't have to lean forever. It is enough to know that you are leaning, so that one day, when strength returns, you can stand a little straighter. And when loyalty has been learned as a posture against the storm, when leaning becomes a reflex to hurt less, a deeper layer reveals itself. Morality temporarily steps aside, so survival can move forward. The Stoics would not call this weakness. They would call it instinct. When survival is threatened, virtue pauses, not forever, but long enough for safety to return. This is not a betrayal of philosophy. It is philosophy's understanding of the human condition. Epictetus once said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." But he also understood that there are moments when what you have to do first is keep the nervous system from collapsing. In those moments, the mind chooses harmony over truth because conflict feels lethal. Not lethal in a philosophical sense, but in a biological one. Exclusion, loss of safety, threat. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Yet this sentence only holds when judgment remains intact. When judgment has been eroded by exhaustion, the way is easily mistaken for the least painful path. Carl Gustav Jung saw this intersection between Stoicism and psychology clearly. When emotional danger rises, the value system retreats. He wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. The psyche seeks balance before it seeks truth. When truth creates friction, and friction equals danger, the mind suspends moral standards as an emergency measure. Not because virtue no longer matters, but because survival has been placed on the scales. The subtlety is this: the suspension does not name itself as suspension. It speaks the language of realism, of wisdom, of being reasonable." Jung warned, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." When the idea harmony is required to survive takes control, it rewrites the value hierarchy. Truth is labeled disruptive, resistance is labeled naive, and silence is promoted to morality. The Stoics would say, this is instinct, not corruption. Seneca wrote, "He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a living man." Yet he also knew that fear can temporarily seize the helm. When survival is threatened, the mind closes windows to retain warmth. Virtue, telling the truth, holding boundaries, judging independently, is put on hold to keep the cold out. Not to be forgotten, but to wait for safety. Jung called this state an emergency adaptation of identity. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When harmony is chosen unconsciously, it does not feel like a choice. It feels self-evident. And because it feels self-evident, it endures. The mind does not say, "I am suspending virtue." It says, "Now is not the time." And "not yet" stretches on because safety has not returned. Stoicism emphasizes clarity as the condition of virtue. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." But in a survival context, being seen as foolish carries risk. And so clarity yields to harmony. Not because clarity is wrong, but because the cost is too high. Jung did not judge this choice. He understood that it keeps people alive. But he pointed to the hidden cost: paralysis of judgment. When conflict is labeled deadly, all disagreement becomes a threat. And when all disagreement is a threat, truth has no entry point. Jung wrote, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness." The danger is not that you harmonize, but that you forget you are harmonizing in order to survive. Here, Stoicism and Jung meet in a crucial reminder. Virtue may pause, but it must not be forgotten. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." That power can be set aside during the storm, but it should not be discarded. It only takes a small marker. I know I am choosing harmony for safety, not because it is right. That marker keeps virtue alive in memory. The subtle danger is this: when safety does not return, the mind renews the suspension. And with each renewal, truth moves a little farther away. Jung warned of unconscious drift. What is temporary becomes permanent if it is not named. He wrote, One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness here is the fear of conflict. When that fear is faced, virtue does not have to fight to return. It only needs permission. The Stoics would say, virtue never disappears. It waits for its moment. Seneca wrote, "As long as you live, keep learning how to live." Learning how to live includes knowing when to remain silent to survive, and when to speak to live rightly. Wisdom lies in not confusing the two moments. Jung agreed. Individuation does not demand continuous heroism. It demands awareness of choice. So when the mind chooses harmony over truth, do not condemn yourself. Name it correctly. Survival instinct. When you name it, you do not crown it with moral authority. You keep a small distance, enough to remember that this is not your final form. Jung believed that as long as that memory remains, identity is not sealed. And then, very slowly, when safety returns, even partially, virtue can open its eyes. Not as rebellion, but as return. A return to judgment. A return to distance. A return to the ability to say, "This keeps me safe, but it is not necessarily right." Marcus Aurelius reminds us, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." That sentence waits for you. It does not leave. Because in the end, harmony saves lives, but truth gives direction. The Stoics understood that there are nights when harmony is needed to survive. Jung understood that if we forget truth for too long, we go on living without knowing what we are living for. Wisdom lies in keeping the memory of virtue alive, even when it must temporarily rest. And when you can do that, through a single, very quiet recognition, you are no longer trapped between weakness and rigidity. You stand in a deeper place, human, with instinct honored, and virtue kept warm for the day it returns. And when we come to understand that harmony can be a survival reflex rather than a betrayal of virtue, an even quieter truth begins to emerge. A truth that does not accuse, but also cannot be ignored. And here is that quiet truth. When survival is threatened, morality becomes flexible. Not because values disappear, but because safety demands compromise. Carl Gustav Jung did not see this as moral decay, but as a conserving movement of the psyche. When the nervous system senses prolonged danger, principles that stand firm in times of peace are folded inward, like sails being lowered in a storm. Not to abandon them, but to keep the vessel from capsizing. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium." The psyche is always searching for balance. When truth causes injury, when conflict feels lethal, the mind reshapes morality in order to continue living. This does not mean that good becomes evil, or that right becomes wrong. It means that standards of action are postponed, that priority yields to existence. Jung did not condemn this. He named it accurately, adaptation. The Stoics understood this as well, though they spoke in a different language. Epictetus reminded us, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." But he also knew that there are moments when what one has to do first is simply remain standing. Seneca wrote, "He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a living man." That sentence does not deny fear. It only reminds us that fear may temporarily take the wheel, but mustn't become eternal truth. Jung went further. When moral flexibility persists, identity itself begins to adapt. He warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When we grow accustomed to compromising for safety, compromise no longer feels like a choice. It becomes how things work. And at that point, the danger lies not in any single action, but in forgetting that this is a survival strategy not our final definition. The subtlety is this: the mind does not tell us that it is compromising. It tells us that it is being realistic. It labels flexibility as wisdom, silence as maturity, compliance as voluntariness. Jung called this the rationalization of the unconscious, the process by which survival decisions are clothed in moral language so as not to provoke inner conflict. He wrote, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." When the idea safety is the highest priority takes control, it reorganizes the value system without our awareness. The Stoics emphasized clarity as the foundation of inner freedom. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." But when survival is threatened, that power is temporarily suspended to prevent collapse. This is not moral failure, it is tactical adjustment. The problem arises only when this adjustment is no longer remembered as temporary. At that point, morality is no longer flexible, it dissolves. Jung did not urge us to condemn ourselves for compromising. He understood that condemnation only increases danger. Instead, he invited a different action, a very quiet one: recognition. Recognizing that the mind is doing the best it can under threat. That recognition does not force immediate change. It simply keeps consciousness from falling asleep. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is the fear of losing safety. Not to banish it, but to prevent it from steering forever. At a deeper level, moral flexibility prepares the ground for the next shift. When identity begins to dissolve into control, when we grow accustomed to compromising for safety, when values have bent for long enough, obedience starts to feel like a personal choice. No one forces us. No one commands us. We say to ourselves, "I choose this." Jung would say, this is the most dangerous moment, because power has been internalized. And when power resides inside, it no longer feels like power. That is why tonight, there is nothing to condemn. No moral court needs to convene. Jung did not believe in healing through accusation. He believed in the gentleness of awareness. There is only one thing to recognize. What the mind is doing is trying to protect you. Even moral flexibility, even compromise, even silence, all of it is an effort to keep you alive in a world that feels dangerous. The Stoics would agree on this point. The first kindness must be directed toward oneself. Seneca wrote, "Wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness." Jung would add, "And the first place that kindness is needed is within." When you stop condemning your survival strategies, you preserve the energy required for the day safety returns. At the next level, we will enter the deepest and most subtle layer. What happens when identity fully dissolves into control, when "this is who I am" can no longer be distinguished from "this is how I am controlled." When obedience is not merely accepted, but identified with. At that point, leaving is no longer frightening because of lost safety, but because of the loss of self. But for now, sleep. Jung placed great importance on sleep as the space where the unconscious self regulates without coercion. He believed that many deep integrations do not occur when we strive to understand, but when we allow. Allow fatigue, allow adaptation, allow ourselves not to be the bravest version tonight. Even a mind that is adapting is still trying to protect you. There is no need to fight it in the dark. Just let it rest, like a tired watchman setting the lamp down. Sleep. Morality does not disappear when you sleep. It simply waits for the day safety returns, so it can take its original shape again.